Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Gender and Development Studies, SOGDS, Postgraduate Diploma in Women's, within which women's movements were born. Before we look more closely at theoretical ideas which inspired the women's question in different time periods and different cultures, this unit will introduce you to various strands of the notion of the history of feminism, and explain how the notion evolved both as a concept and movement. Discussions on the history of feminism unfolded the idea that women across the globe have diversifying experiences, realities, and positions emerging from the institutions and situations where the women are located. There is no universal history of feminism is the key and central argument here. We will use the operative definition of feminism as an agency to challenge 2.2 Learning outcomes. After completing this unit, you will be able to define and explain what feminism means, critically analyze women's oppression from diversifying positions and contexts, describe various approaches of feminism in historical context, explain women's diversifying realities across caste, class, race, ethnicity, time and society, and analyze the development of feminism in different spans of time. 2.3 The plural nature of feminism. We will begin by drawing your attention to the title of this section, which employs the plural to refer to feminism. Thus, from the very beginning we seek to establish that there is no one history of feminism. Indeed, the unfolding of the history of feminism alerts us to the idea that women all over the world have very different experiences and realities to contend with. No one narration can presume to encapsulate the experience of all women all over the world. In other words, a universal history of feminism is not possible, nor is it desirable. If we must have a broad definition of feminism, then it can best be described as a challenge to the oppression and marginalization that women face in their diverse contexts. Since these contexts are different, obviously the experiences are different, and hence the feminist challenge to these experiences would also be different. What we could do at best is to plot the broad contours of the attempts that women the world over have made to challenge and change the oppression that they are faced with. Again, a word of caution: it would not be possible for us to look at all such attempts. We will have to make choices and thereby exclude many. But if you find this account of the histories of feminism interesting, we are sure that you will explore further and witness startling differences as well as amazing similarities. But, before we embark upon the history of feminism, we need to spend some time clarifying certain fundamental issues. For instance, how do we define feminism? Does anyone who is concerned with women's issues in general and women's oppression in particular qualify to be described as a feminist? This is an issue that divides scholars and activists alike. It is impossible to define feminism in terms of a core set of concepts. Women in the distant past have sometimes very courageously questioned the social structures that oppressed them. Does that make it an instance of feminist resistance? For instance, Mirabai. There are many instances of women's initiatives and actions from our times that we would hesitate to describe as feminist. There is clearly a kind of consciousness that imbues feminism and a specific historical context that made it possible for feminism to emerge. By familiarizing ourselves with some of the currents in the history of feminism, let us try to achieve some kind of clarity on the question of what is feminism and then its varied history. Feminism as a term emerged long after women started questioning their inferior status and demanding a change in that status. Should all theories and actions intend to improve women's position, intentionally or unintentionally, be seen as feminist? Or is feminism to be understood as a body of thought and action that has its own distinctive history, practice, and ideas? We would be more comfortable with the latter position, and of course we hasten to add that there is no one history of feminist practice or idea. For centuries, women's voices and struggles have not been heard or recorded. Thus, there is not much access to what women thought, but the fact is that women have always thought about their lives and tried to resist their subordination. Women were not seen as political creatures for most part of history. Their lives were seen as confined to the home and the hearth. Thus, not much is known about the political views or Aspirations of women, as women's voices in general were not considered worthy of record, much less their political voices, which were thought to be non-existent. But the fact is that in the rich corpus of oral history, including poems, folk tales, etc., women's attempts to understand, explain, ridicule and challenge the basis of their lives may be glimpsed. In the next section, we will look at women's early attempts to voice feminist ideas and their dissatisfaction with their given roles in society. 2.3.1 Feminist Foremothers. Early feminist, the limits of Enlightenment. A reformist approach with the broad sweeping changes that Europe began to experience around the 14th century. A new way of being and thinking was inaugurated. As you know, feudalism was on its way out, and new ways of organizing the economy emerged. Trade, in the wake of navigational advances, became the fulcrum around which society, economy and indeed the polity came to be organized. The state needed to be less fragmented, more centralized, and needed a standing, well-organized army to guarantee law and order on trade routes to meet the demands of the new class of mercantile capitalists. Many parts of Europe saw the development of centralized states which organized and generated revenue. Old feudal ties began to weaken, and new methods of organizing social, familial and religious life gradually emerged. New questions about the individual and the state and society came to be asked. Indeed, the idea of the individual itself was new. Women were also obviously affected by these changes, and feminism may be broadly defined as a specific response to the challenges and opportunities that modernity brought in its wake, albeit, like most things, unequally for women. By the second half of the 17th century, the distinction between the public and the private came to be etched rather sharply in England. The nature of agriculture changed, and a growing army of wage laborers, very different from the earlier family-based system of production, became the order of the day. Thus, for the first time, a distinction between the public world of employment and the private world of the home emerges. Women who were up until now partners in work found themselves squeezed out of work. Economic activities that were carried out from homesteads now increasingly shifted to new locales outside the home. Aristocratic women who partnered their husbands in the management of their estates were increasingly restricted to the running of the household. A host of economic and demographic factors created a situation where women began to look at marriage as the only viable solution to their economic insecurities. As boundaries between the public and the private became sharper, and women's role in this new divide became a matter of contention. Such a distinction was unheard of in earlier societies, and hence the question of women's sphere and role was not a very pertinent question. The beginnings of capitalist modernity create a new kind of social and economic organization, relegating women to the private sphere with adverse impact on women. Thus, to ask questions about women's role in life, and to either reject or challenge the public-private divide, is in some sense characteristic of the feminist articulation. And this is what makes feminism modern. Since England was in the throes of economic changes and political unrest, obviously these changes affected men and women. However, women's voices typically went unheard, so that we literally have to ferret out voices of the likes of Mary Astell, 1661 to 1731, who employed the newly emerging liberal discourse in a classic way to examine the impact of these advances on the lives of women. In a way, her arguments lay down the foundation of the classic liberal feminist question. If all human beings have rationality and therefore are deserving of freedom of choice and autonomy, how come women are kept out of this charmed circle? Ironically, through many politically conservative arguments. She does not expect political rights for women, and enjoins married women to accept their husbands in the likes of a monarch, much like the sovereign state in the private sphere. Mary Astell concludes that women should think of life, work, and learning without men in secular nunneries. Sadly, however, Mary Astell was written out of public memory of the history of 18th century England. Mary Astell was not a solitary voice in the wilderness. There were many other women who articulated similar concerns, indicating that women had begun to think of themselves as a group, with similar quests in search of similar answers. However, these women stopped short of challenging the existing social and economic arrangements that marginalized women. They definitely did not challenge the existing norms of division of labor, nor did they have any coherent political program for an extension of rights to women. Most of these women belonged to the upper echelons of society and addressed other women like themselves. So in the end they were socially and politically conservative. But they did take cognizance of the fact that women as a group were battling certain unresolved issues, and they more often than not thought of education and opportunities as the solution. The 18th century has a mixed record to report in Europe, with the early years being somewhat hostile to feminist consciousness as represented by the Blue Stockings. Hannah More, who is a good representative of this group, argued that women are endowed with sensibility rather than reason, and that they are best suited to pursue domestic roles which, however, would be performed well with exposure to education. Despite the fact that these women's opinions are not close to what we may describe as feminist ideas, still, the existence of a group of women engaged in intellectual discussions was enough of a challenge to the prevailing notions of womanhood. By the second half of the 18th century, the American and the French Revolution unleashed people's political energies and created the context for interrogation of all accepted norms and structures in society. It was truly revolutionary times. On both sides of the Atlantic, women began to question the basis of their inequality. On the one hand, philosophers of the revolution spoke eloquently about freedom and rights of men, grounding it in the fundamental and universal faculty of reason. But on the other hand, they not only failed to extend this possibility towards women, they actually argued that such an extension is not possible because women are fundamentally different and do not possess reason and therefore are not deserving of freedom. The best known challenge to some of the ideas mentioned above came from Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women, published in 1792. Once again, she was not the only one to articulate this challenge. Many others in France and the United States of America echoed similar sentiments. You would be interested to know of women's role and dramatic instances of participation in the French Revolution, women in Paris demanding bread. The tricoteuses knitting under the guillotine have passed into the legend of the French Revolution that sparked the fire of women's desire for liberty and equality. Their role, typically, was never read as part of the main script of the revolution, but it laid enough of a firm foundation for women to draw inspiration from later on in France and elsewhere. Interestingly, in the initial days of the revolution, women's clubs and women's cries for change were encouraged, but as the movement gathered momentum, all this was brought to an abrupt end. Women's voices were gagged. In fact, some of the most prominent spokeswomen were imprisoned or put to death, but all this was not before igniting among women in France and elsewhere a passion for freedom and dignity. Many believed that of all the evils that the French Revolution unleashed, women speaking out must surely be the worst and the most dreaded. Coming 2 years after the revolution, Mary Wollstonecraft's book seemed like an extension of the unruly women of the French Revolution. Thus, it seemed like a book steeped in revolutionary fervor. She was writing at a time when industrialization had gathered steam, but not enough to provide women with respectable employment. The only options existing for women were low-paying jobs in appalling conditions. Middle-class women continued to be economically dependent on marriage and husbands, with lifestyles which had become very stifling given the complete separation of the private and the public. Mary Wollstonecraft's basic argument was an extension of. They argued that neither was able to address the root cause of women's oppression. Radical feminism proceeds from the assumption that, in order to understand the fundamental nature of and reasons for women's oppression, a move away from received theoretical paradigms was necessary. The fresh perspective emerges from the insights and lived experiences of women. The second crucial argument is that women's oppression is the fundamental oppression on which other forms of domination and control are resting. It follows that women, as a group, are united by a common cause and their interests can never be reconciled with that of men. In fact, so strong is this common cause that race, class, or ethnicity may be overcome in the pursuit of this common sisterhood. Hence, also, the Assumption that women can seek to change the world by sharing their personal experiences, and not merely through endless theoretical speculation. Finally, the idea that gave our times the catchy feminist slogan of "personal is political." This slogan rests on the argument that politics is not confined as traditionally understood to the public sphere, but is very much a part of the personal sphere as well, spheres hitherto regarded as sacrosanct, such as that of the family and of sexuality. By the 1970s, these new ideas were reflected in Kate Millett's classic Sexual Politics, and Shulamit Firestone's The Dialectic of Sex, among many other books. It was the former book that is credited with the popularization of the idea of patriarchy, as used by feminists the world over today. Her rather simple but forcefully stated argument was that in all societies the relationship between men and women is based on power, and this makes the relationship between the sexes political in nature. She gave a dramatic twist to her explanations when she proclaimed that all history has been a history of men oppressing women, albeit in different forms in different contexts. American women were dying in illegal abortion facilities, Indian women committed sati, African women underwent clitoridectomy, and Chinese women were subjected to foot binding. All these women are united across time and space by a single factor: patriarchy. Radical feminism, while being very attractive, has also been criticized for being ahistorical, essentialist, and universalist. Later radical feminists have responded rather creatively to these allegations. However, it is thanks to radical feminist insights that it is possible today to understand and theorize issues such as domestic violence, pornography, and sexual violence of all kinds, including within the home. Radical feminism opened up spaces for debates on motherhood, reproductive technology, and of course on heterosexuality. In the process, feminism was able to go to places that were hitherto sealed off as personal. The personal truly became political. Issues such as dowry, rape, and violence came to dominate the campaigns at this time. In the South Asian subcontinent, the 1970s was a period of great turbulence and disturbance. The national emergency was imposed in 1975. In India, post-emergency, many women's groups began to self-consciously describe themselves as feminists. Most of these groups had moved away from the established political parties and were looking to write history on their own. Check your progress too. What were some of the changes taking place in the role of women, and the evolution of feminist ideas in the post-war period? 2.5 The backlash and the response. By the end of the 1980s, there was a strong feeling in America that equality between the sexes had been achieved, and in fact women were now in a position of advantage as compared with men. This became the theme song of the anti-feminist backlash that fed into the ideology of the new right. Feminism came to be held responsible for all the ills of the American society. Susan Faludi has captured the nuances of these arguments in her well-known book, Backlash: The Undeclared War Against Women. In the 1990s, feminism of the liberal equal rights variety consciously tried to move away from the image of the oppressed woman to that of the woman with initiative and agency. Significantly, the political import of coercive sex and the need to act politically against it is increasingly acknowledged by liberal feminists. It is no longer pushed into the private sphere where it is treated as a mere personal matter, moving away from the earlier demand of joining men in the workplace. The demand now is for a restructuring of the workplace itself to make it more compatible with family life. Parallel to this, a greater involvement by men in the domestic sphere is sought. The shift is worth noticing. Whereas in the 1960s and 1970s, the focus was entirely on the public sphere, by the 90s there is a realization that the public cannot be changed without addressing the private. This shift is not only politically significant, it is also a fundamental challenge to the liberal idea of the dichotomy between the public and the private. Thus, many equal rights feminists have moved away from some of their key liberal positions and have acknowledged the shared nature of apparently isolated individual private experience. This has led them to ask for substantial changes in the manner in which the private domain itself is organized, especially the whole issue of care and responsibility within the family. Yet another significant departure is their asking for state intervention in the private sphere of life as well. In the post-1980s world of feminism, a lot of discussion has centered on the question of whether there is at all a fundamental form of oppression. The next questions have been, who can speak for whom? Can the category of women hold ground in the context of the differences that have now been highlighted? In fact, today many feminists would agree that opening up the feminist field to differences has permitted us to place women in a matrix of oppression and privilege, where no one is a permanent occupant of either of the two positions. This approach challenges the idea of permanent contradictions and frozen hierarchies. It also suggests that different forms of oppression intersect at different historical points, and indeed, there is no hierarchy of oppressions rendering one more significant than the other. This insight has led to women from different backgrounds to question the validity of what seemed like the outpourings of white women from the West. One of the strongest challenges has come from black women in America and to some extent Britain. The general mood of Islamophobia that seems to have gripped the world now is ironically also the context for a great deal of discussion on what has been described as Islamic feminism. Closer home is the articulation by Dalit feminists and the serious charge that feminism in India is guilty of being Brahminical in its orientation. Able-bodied feminists have been rightly told repeatedly about the completely different experience of womanhood by women with disabilities, and thus the encounter of women with disabilities of a world characterized by patriarchy is substantially different from that of able-bodied women. You will read about all of these specific claims in much greater detail in subsequent units of this course. Angela Davis is of the opinion that a feminism that begins with the experiences of white middle-class women would have very little room in it for the experiences of black women. After all, a key aspect of white women's privilege is to talk of themselves as though they are indeed talking about all women, and if there are some women whose experiences and struggles don't fit, they are seen as marginal. This is very similar to the situation of upper caste class feminists in India who, it has been pointed out by Dalit feminists, that upper caste class women failed to understand the experiences of Dalit women. Of course, the whole discourse on black feminism has been challenged as being not sufficiently sensitive to differences among black women. For example, black women in America do benefit from the exploitation of the labor of black women in Africa. In other words, this is a warning against using any category in an essentializing or universalizing way. Besides the issues mentioned above, the end of the 1980s saw an increasing concern within feminism to understand sexuality not just in terms of sexual violence but also as desire and pleasure, and take sexuality beyond the pale of heteronormativity. The issue of sexuality with a different focus and the greater acceptance of lesbian, gay and bisexual issues within the fold of feminism have come to characterize the 1990s. Issues of queer liberation in Block 3 of this course will present you with detailed discussions around issues related to queer sexualities. 2.6 Postmodernist turn in feminist history. Yet another dimension to the feminist discourse has been provided by postmodernism. Since the late 1980s, postmodernism has been relentlessly questioning binaries of all sorts, doubting the possibility of certitude and finiteness in the pursuit of knowledge as well, rejecting the idea of an objectivity based on rationality. Most of these ideas sit very comfortably within the fold of feminism, for the latter has accused existing norms of reason and objectivity of being partial and based on male reason. By the end of the 1980s, it was obvious to women's groups that there was no uncomplicated woman as the subject of feminist politics or of the pursuit of gender justice in India or anywhere else. Nivedita Menon has argued that these developments have brought forth the realization that women as a ready-made subject of feminist politics does not exist. Instead, women are located within a grid of identities ranging from caste, class, religion, among other possible identities. She argues that people are mobilized along the grid of multiple identities. At different times and in different political conditions, different identities are foregrounded. In other words, just because many women have come together, it does not mean that they have indeed come together as women. They could have gathered together because they are upper caste class or because they are Tamil. Subjecthood, to put it differently, has to be the conscious result of deliberate political mobilization. Only when women are consciously thinking about their lives as women in the context of gender inequality and marginality, and seek political solutions, do they become subjects of feminist history. The universal, for example, to only talk of women as if no differences exist among women would be the use of a universal category. Needs to be critiqued, for it more often than not tends to become undemocratic, hiding within it all kinds of differences and discrimination. But we need to remind ourselves that often the specific also tends to become universalizing, and then it needs to be challenged. In the section on black feminism, we saw how the term black itself, which is supposedly specific, universalizes the experiences of diverse groups of black women, such as black women in America versus black women in Africa, and so on. In other words, there really cannot be permanent and frozen identities. It is the admission of this conflict and tension that will generate a more democratic feminist history and politics where no category, not even that of the Dalit feminist, can be seen as final and finished. The unmarked woman can no longer be the ideal subject of feminism. The impact of these new arguments is that it is no longer common to hear of feminist sisterhoods as it is to hear of feminist solidarities. Bell Hooks, for instance, has argued that sisterhood suggests similarity and thus leads to the inevitable trap of homogenization, whereas solidarity suggests the possibility of various kinds of diverse oppressions coming together. Indeed, even men who are oppressed could be part of this solidarity. Bell Hooks deliberately spell her name without capitalization as a strategy to draw attention to her marginalization as an African American woman. However, some feminists have today woken up to the pitfalls of walking all the way with postmodernism, for it could create a new set of issues. Postmodernism emphasizes differences and shifting subjectivities. You will read in greater detail about this topic in the unit on feminism and deconstruction. In the course on constructing gender through arts theory, has talked about the possibility of forging strategic sisterhoods, constantly keeping in mind the power relations that created particular identities. Nivedita Menon, in her book Recovering Subversion, has argued that it is possible for feminist politics to employ both the strategies of deconstruction and interrogation of the identity of woman, thereby exposing the constructed nature of identities, and at other times to employ the strategy of invoking an identity in order to engage in the radical politics of subversion. 2.7 Summary. The unit would have helped you to view women's oppression in both historical and present contexts, and engage with issues of right, identity, sexuality, political participation, heteronormativity, and so on. Thus, women as an identity may be deconstructed when faced with a conservative agenda. If you hear a statement such as, women don't do this or that, you could turn around and ask which women, of what class, which community, in what time period etc., and at other times faced with the need for progressive political mobilization, it should be possible to invoke women. While this unit has presented you with as comprehensive a picture as possible of the account of the history of feminisms, it is of course beyond the scope of any one unit to cover every possible event and topic. Therefore, this account of the history of feminisms has had to make some choices and focus on a select and representative range of issues and contexts. The idea was to give you a sketch of the vast terrain of feminism. You will explore this further in the rest of the courses of this program and also, we hope, on your own. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next video with the next chapter.